Brilliant. Well, let me echo Rachel in saying how much I would have enjoyed being there with you in Cambridge, not just for this panel, but really for the entire conference. When I first was approached and asked whether I'd wanted to join you there, of course I was delighted, and also my interest was piqued precisely because the conference is taking place in Cambridge, where I did my own PhD and spent really quite a long time, and is on this particular topic of crisis and resilience. And it gave me the opportunity to think back a little bit and reflect on the intellectual environment there 20 years ago, where these topics, these notions were only beginning to take contours, really. Very few, if any, of my peers were writing on this, and I can see from the amazing program that you've put together that this has changed radically, and I think rightly so. Many narratives of the past use what David Clarke classically has coined the brick model of culture change, with one culture being built on another, most change being slow and steady. And while those periods clearly do exist, the emerging paleoenvironmental and paleoclimatic information that we have been able to produce over the last 20, 30 years clearly points in the direction of planet Earth being much more unruly than what we could previously capture, and the past being much more volatile in the first instance environmentally than what we have been able to operate with as kind of as a canvas against which to reconstruct cultural histories. So increasingly, the evidence coming to us from other disciplines has questioned the notion of slow and steady developments. And of course, the crisis that we're experiencing at the moment and the parlance associated with climate change adaptation is also putting a pressure or pull on archaeological research to write itself into the emerging discourse around climate change adaptation. And all of this has happened over the last 20 or 30 years for real. And there are a bunch of particular case studies that you can use to investigate, where you can really see this change in orientation. A classic one being, for instance, the Norse occupation of Greenland, which in the old days was a story told very much as one of obstinate farmers arriving and eventually succumbing to the cold of the Little Ice Age. And then following the emergent resilience paradigm, this narrative has taken a very different spin, despite the evidence still pointing in the direction of obstinate farmers eventually succumbing to the challenges of the Little Ice Age. And the topic of crisis has led to the publication of a great number of articles and books over the last years in particular. And I'm sure most of you in the audience will be familiar with these, maybe you even read some of them. And the literature here can be, in some ways, broadly be divided into those who sort of go all in terms of catastrophic change, who puts the template of crisis across many archaeological case studies, often by eyeballing different kinds of time series data, say paleoclimatic or paleoenvironmental evidence, and more or less poorly resolved archaeological stratigraphies or radiocarbon dates. And if some form of correlation exists, then that usually that can be taken as a starting point for the argument of crisis or even collapse. And of course, books like Jared Diamond's Collapse has engendered, I mean, not just debates in the pub or the parlor, but really a massive secondary literature of people critiquing his ideas, critiquing his whole approach, and so on. There are countless works out there that effectively have emerged as a kind of cottage industry around Jared Diamond's works. And the other side of the ring, basically, you have people who question collapse, who question crisis, who analyze the narratives and the evidence in favor of ancient crises and ancient collapses from both an empirical perspective, often a very much case-based perspective, and who deconstruct these episodes of radical change in the past. And surely, these authors rarely see face to face, but surely the truth in most cases is somewhere in the middle. Many an episode of culture change in the past did revolve around some kind of period of crisis. There are many case studies we can point to, but of course that is not universally true of all change. Cultures change also in the absence of any kind of external pressure or climate change, environmental change. So much of it, in that sense, may boil down to an empirical question. But we're also here to discuss conceptual matters. And there are many rich points of contact with Rachel's presentation just before, but I'd also like to go in a slightly different direction, and we can see where we'll meet in the final discussion. So part of the problem in applying notions of crisis and of resilience in an archaeological context is that crisis really has no formal or universally accepted definition at all. It is a vernacular term that has different meanings for different people. And resilience has also entered regular language use, even though there are many disciplines out there who use it in very technical, very specific terms. However, the term itself has a very complicated etymology, and even within a particular neighboring discipline, such as disaster studies or climate change adaptation studies, resilience itself will be used differently by different people. So it's very hard, or also very easy, to apply a term that has no formal definition and has never been universally operationalized in an archaeological context. So in sympathy, often with the people we study, we apply this term as a kind of positive moniker in trying, in an effort to describe the many wonderful ways, creative ways in which past peoples have coped with whatever challenges they were facing. But in doing so, we also have to be careful that we're effectively not doing those ancient community a disservice, because if we continue to tell stories about human communities of the past effectively being hyper-resilient, effectively being able to manage and overcome any kind of challenge they face, then we also risk downplaying the crisis that we're facing today, for instance. Right? Because achieving resilience usually comes at a cost, and I think to me that is one of the main features that has often been ignored in this particular discourse. So in my own work, and I can recommend this to anyone working on these topics, I've drawn great inspiration from now classical works in risk reduction literature or disaster studies literature. For instance, there's this wonderful a book originally published in the 1980s by Ben Wiesner and colleagues called At Risk, in which they present a kind of formal, semi-quantitative, mostly qualitative model of how vulnerability, so sort of the flip side of resilience, emerges as an historically constituted property through a series of confluences of different processes that then may interact with a particular stressor, a hazard here on the right-hand side of the graph, to create a kind of a disaster and thereby precipitate a crisis. And the interesting thing here is that just before they published the original first edition of the book, they also published a very short note in Nature. That was apparently possible back in those days, arguing forcefully that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. So much like Nixon's idea of slow violence, they really wanted to effectively purge the term natural disaster from the English language vocabulary. That, of course, has by no means happened. It is and remains very popular with the press, but it is also used for convenience in daily conversations. But really, of course, disaster only emerges in interplay between human society that is in some way or another affected by a stressor and the underlying conditions that make life unsafe, that make life precarious in the first instance. So the kind of fairly simple kind of list-based approach that you can glean from a model such as this already highlights that there are multiple levels, multiple scales, and multiple processes that need to be considered in interaction if we're interested in studying past crises. Okay, and if you were to read Wisner's book in a little bit more detail, you also find that in addition to this particular model, which they call the pressure and release model, they also operate with the so-called access model, which really focuses on household components and household adaptations, household resilience. So very much of the underlying processes that feed into the pressure and release model are in Wisner and colleagues' view related to the ways in which households, that is small, domestic, economically more or less independent units, operate within the broader societal context. And of course, that is actually really cool, because households can often be more or less identified in the archaeological record. Anything from a single component hunter-gatherer site to a particular house floor to a house building within a wider community can be used as a proxy to identify past household activities. So here there is a potential link, useful link to the empirical material in the archaeological record. And to stay sort of stay within the Cambridge bubble, this household model actually articulates, I believe, very well with some really classic, you could even say old school archaeological work. For instance, this fantastic edited volume here called Bad Year Economics, Cultural Response to Risk and Uncertainty. Now, the term resilience, this was published in the 80s, and the term resilience doesn't feature in this book at all, but actually this is exactly what it's all about. It is about how people react to particular kinds of stresses, the options that are at their availability, and how efficacious they are in terms of the spatial extent of the crisis and the temporal extent of the crisis. So here there is an opportunity to think very traditional archaeological evidence about coming to us from, say, zooarchaeology, from pollen studies, but also from on-site studies about storage patterns and so on, to exchange studies using, for example, lithic sourcing or exotic raw materials or other kinds of proxy indicators for social networks or trade chains, and of course also to think about mobility as one of the key factors. So the four elements, risk management strategy elements you see here, those are taken straight out of Halstead and O'Shea's publication, and they articulate really seamlessly with the kinds of models used in disaster risk reduction studies to capture the degree to which a given household, and then at a higher scale, a given community or society, displays resilience or displays vulnerability. And the pluses and the minuses that I've put in this table here, they really relate to the kind of effectiveness of these kinds of strategies, so that we can, in principle, look at the archaeological evidence from before a particular crisis hits and evaluate to what degree a given society or community was able to utilize certain risk management strategies, certain resilience strategies in relation to the crisis to come. And once these lose their effectiveness, if the crisis is too long or too large, the costs too high, then we would expect to see culture change in the wake of such stresses. But let's return to the paleoenvironmental data and also to the relation of these kind of studies to our modern world. So many of you will be familiar with this sort of graph. It's kind of the extended hockey stick, if you will, a temperature proxy curve derived on the Greenland ice cores. I've taken this straight out of a wonderful publication by Brovkin et al. In 2021 in Nature Geoscience, where they discuss a series of socio-ecological tipping points where climatic states radically change over very short periods of time, and where attendant societal impacts can also be studied. In my own work, I've looked a great deal at the period around the Bølling Allerød, both its onset, but also how it later unfolded in relation to extreme environmental events such as volcanic eruptions. So the interaction between temperature, volatile temperature change, and volcanic eruptions. And then later, I've also looked a great deal at the 8,200 event, which coincides with the very large Storegga tsunami in the North Sea Basin. So again, the interaction of an unfolding directional change in the underlying temperature that people were experiencing, then coupled with an extreme and unforeseeable event, and how these two together really shape what we may define as a kind of a collapse event or a crisis. Each on their own is unlikely to have had that kind of effect, but it is the combination of directional change and an unforeseeable stressor. And this, of course, is not so different to the kinds of processes that we're experiencing here at the onset of the Anthropocene. Extreme events are forecast to become more frequent and more extreme, putting lives and livelihoods under pressure. But we're also very much experiencing directional climate change, which also is prognosed to become more severe in the future. So archaeology, I do believe, has a very clear and very important role to play here. And many of us work on case studies that are becoming increasingly empirically robust. And let me remind you of, this is of course tooting my own horn here a little bit, but I think in this context, it's quite all right. Let me remind you that both in the environmental humanities and in the geosciences, there are strong ethical movements arguing for an engagement of these academic disciplines with contemporary climate change debates. Some even call for civil disobedience rooted in the scientific insights. Right? This debate has not had a great deal of impact on archaeology, but many of us sit with concrete case-based data sets, empirically robust inference that allow empirically robust inferences about how past societies have reacted or failed to react to particular kind of climatic or environmental stresses. And it is arguable that we are ethically obliged, or should at least be thinking about how to communicate those kind of cases to the public. And in that sense, the narrative of crisis is a powerful one. Much climate change communication research points in the direction of both narrative presentations being very efficacious in terms of communicating seriousness of risk, but also that stories that do not have a happy ending actually catalyze action more strongly than those that do. So we should be conscious and deliberate and informed about how we tell and also sell our archaeological stories of past resilience and crisis. There is much good in the anthropological literature around disasters and crises. This was there are many good publications from especially around the end of the last millennium, with several edited volumes and a great number of articles providing a wealth of comparative case studies, both from the recent and deeper past, that offer really a range of useful models against which the archaeological evidence can be related and evaluated. So here, sort of towards the end of my presentation, let me remind you of a model by Dyer that also has a useful temporal dimension, although he worked through this in relation to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So a relatively shallow time approach, but very thick description of how local communities had to react to this particular kind of event. But it has a useful time axis in the sense that also in his case, it really wasn't just one single stressor, but it was the combination of a crisis unfolding over time, gradually eroding the ability of local communities to adequately respond. And this I've certainly found useful in taking it into the deep passing, asking critical questions about multiple stressors, but also temporal dimensions, the temporal dimensions of crisis. So on the one hand, we should be striving to provide as robust and accurate and precise chronologies of culture change, of past environmental change as possible, but we should also not be expecting that one particular correlation will provide us with a smoking gun evidence for an ancient crisis or collapse, because as Rachel was also alluding to, right, crises unfold over time. They can be slow, and they always relate to processes that unfold at different kinds of temporalities or temporal paces. Right? So this doesn't make our work any easier, but it does mean that we need to be looking more closely at what kinds of evidence we should and can gather in relation to capturing crises in a more holistic way than simply eyeballing some correlation. So while there may be no natural disasters, no crises that are simply mechanistic in that we have a volcanic eruption or some kind of temperature change and then a society collapses, there may be no natural disasters, but it doesn't mean that past climate change, past environmental change, past hazards didn't have any societal consequences. Single events rarely, if ever, lead to major change, but multiple stresses may be. There is a massive challenge in robustly identifying resilience archaeologically. So really, please do not use persistence as a proxy for resilience. Do not use change as a proxy for resilience. The argument has to be more nuanced. It has to be more sophisticated. I'm a big fan of comparative study designs using multiple theoretically motivated angles, because they allow us to effectively treat different cases as kind of experimental setups, allowing us to capture the different ways in which particular societies may or may not have adapted or changed in relation to particular stresses. So in the future, I do think there should be more attention to indirect and delayed impacts, these different temporalities of change. And ideally, we should be moving towards hypothesis-driven analytical approaches that are rooted in particular kind of theoretical constructs, rather than using terms such as crisis and resilience as merely post hoc narrative labels that we apply to describe the kinds of processes that we can reconstruct from the archaeological record. Thank you very much.